Picture this. You're driving down an isolated stretch of American highway. It's the dead of night. Your headlights are literally the only things piercing the absolute darkness. And suddenly, your engine just dies. It's a primal fear, right? The stranded motorist, the endless dark, the creeping feeling that you are suddenly very, very vulnerable. Well, welcome to this explainer. Today, we're dissecting the anatomy of the American highway horror. We're going to explore exactly where these terrifying legends come from, and more importantly, how modern creators actually manufacture that exact feeling of dread on screen.
To set the mood, let's look at this chilling modern legend. It's exactly 2:17 a.m. A 22-year-old named Ethan is driving home through a small American town when his car suddenly dies on Blackwood Road. He's surrounded by dense forest, and his phone says no signal. Off to the side, he spots an old house with a little girl standing in the window. When Ethan knocks, the door swings open on its own into pitch blackness. From upstairs, the girl's voice echoes, "Are you here to find my dad?" When Ethan asks where her dad is, she points down to an old photograph on the wall. Ethan steps closer, and his hands and feet turn ice cold. The photo is 30 years old, but it shows the exact same house and the exact same little girl. Suddenly, a voice behind him whispers, "She is still waiting for her dad today." Ethan spins around, nobody's there. But looking back at the front window, he now sees three figures staring out: the little girl, an old man, and Ethan himself. The next morning, police found Ethan's car. The creepy part, the engine was running and the door was open, but Ethan was never seen again. The locals will tell you, if you see a house on Blackwood Road at 2:17 a.m., do not stop, because she's still waiting.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here's how we'll break it down. First, America's phantom car folklore. Second, the anatomy of fear. Third, lighting the darkness. Fourth, mastering horror sound design. And finally, adding the camera shake.
All right, Part 1, America's Phantom Car Folklore.
To really understand this modern highway horror, we actually have to look back at the origins of the automobile itself. When cars first hit the roads, they brought freedom, sure, but they also brought a whole new wave of ghostly American folklore. Think about it. In the early 1900s, rural, tight-knit communities were used to the slow, predictable clip-clop of horse-drawn carriages. Suddenly, you've got these loud, fast, ground-shaking machines tearing through town in the dead of night. They allowed strangers and criminals to appear and vanish like literal phantoms. This rapid technological change created deep societal anxiety. It really wasn't long before the very real fear of masked bandits evolved into something completely supernatural.
It's absolutely fascinating to trace the actual, documented reports from early American newspapers. Back in 1911, members of a psychical research society reported seeing a phantom auto at a dangerous curve called Devil's Bend. The car was allegedly driven by two skeletons, one of them calmly smoking a cigarette, if you can believe it, before it crashed and just vanished in flames. Then in 1914, you had the Minneapolis Phantom Bandits. These were real criminals who used a big blue touring car with no lights to mug pedestrians and just melt away into the dark. And interestingly, by 1917, we get Ghostina in New York. This was a car that garage workers swore would aggressively shake and vibrate all on its own at exactly 2 a.m., supposedly occupied by the vaporous ghost of a massive man.
This eerie anxiety is perfectly captured by a rancher named Bob Hill in 1928, right after he claimed a ghostly car materialized directly in his path. He wrote, "There arises from the highway before you the outline of another automobile. From its radiator and sides it gives forth a soft, strange, iridescent light, as though it had been coated with phosphorus." He described slamming on his brakes, skidding right into the ditch, only to realize the road was entirely empty. It's this exact isolation and paranoia that fuels stories like Ethan on Blackwood Road. Moving on to Part 2, the anatomy of fear.
So, how do we actually take that raw historical dread and translate it into a visceral experience for a modern audience? Because we aren't just here to swap ghost stories today. We are looking at the specific psychological triggers and technical tools that filmmakers use to produce that spine-tingling sensation on screen. If you want to create your own viral haunted highway masterpiece, you really need to understand the dark arts of lighting, sound, and visual effects.
Which brings us to Part 3, lighting the darkness.
So the crucial point is that the first pillar of on-screen horror is lighting. When you're trying to simulate a spooky midnight encounter in the middle of nowhere, what you don't show is often just as important as what you do show. According to horror lighting techniques from Camp Films, it turns out you actually want to ditch traditional flattering three-point lighting. You just toss it out. Instead, you rely on low-key lighting, which is using a single key light to create harsh, dramatic shadows right across a subject's face. Backlighting is also incredibly effective. By placing the light behind your subject, you turn them into an ominous, unidentifiable silhouette. And hey, don't be afraid of underexposing your image. Making the scene intentionally darker than normal maintains this constant feeling of tension, making your viewer physically strain their eyes just to feel safe.
And this brilliantly illustrates the power of atmosphere. I mean, the difference between a standard 3D scene and one with volumetric fog is just staggering. As technical artist Bart Ronsky notes, if you just add fog without proper global illumination, which is the way light naturally bounces around an environment, it results in this unrealistic, intense darkening because no light is in scattering. In a horror context, you can actually use these exact principles to manipulate the atmosphere, intentionally choking out the ambient light to make an environment feel completely suffocating and terrifying.
All right, Part 4, Mastering Horror Sound Design.
Now listen, you can have the darkest, foggiest road in the world, but if the audio is flat, literally nobody is getting scared. The true secret to spooking someone is entirely in the horror sound design. Professional sound designers use very specific tools to manipulate your heartbeat. As the experts at Storyblocks explain, you have risers and stingers. Risers are those long, building sounds, like screeching metallic strings or maybe a reversed piano, that signal to the audience that something terrible is about to happen. They put you on high alert. Stingers, on the other hand, are the sharp, sudden hits, thuds, or stabs. Think of the stinger as the actual sound of the jump scare itself.
If you compare a scene with and without this design, the difference is night and day. Without it, you just have this awkward silence. But with it, you start by layering ambient wind and leaves underneath to keep the audience on edge. Then, you introduce a riser to build the volume and speed. And right at the peak of the tension, you drop the audio to absolute silence for just a few seconds, lulling the viewer into a false sense of security, and then, bam, you hit them with a massive stinger. That is exactly how you turn a boring clip of a closed door into a heart-stopping nightmare.
And finally, Part 5, Adding the Camera Shake. Think back to when Ethan looks at that window and realizes he's staring at his own ghost. The camera shouldn't be perfectly still in a moment like that. It needs to reflect pure panic. To simulate that chaotic energy digitally, you can use the camera shake effect in Premiere Pro. As detailed by Miracamp, it's surprisingly simple. First, you drag the transform effect onto your clip. Second, scale the footage up to about 1:15 so you don't see those weird black edges when the frame starts moving. Third, create position keyframes every 3 frames, alternating the movement, like left, down, right, up, so it feels natural and erratic, not like a mechanical robot. And finally, adding motion blur totally sells the realism of that sudden movement. Let's move to and see how this builds. A digital camera shake doesn't just mimic a handheld camera, it actually simulates disorientation. It places the viewer directly in the shoes of a terrified protagonist. When you pair that with the low-key lighting leaving the background in shadows and that sudden audio stinger just shattering the silence, this subtle camera shake completely seals the illusion of total, overwhelming fear. So what does this all mean? From the skeletal drivers at Devil's Bend back in 1911 to Ethan vanishing without a trace on Blackwood Road, the American highway has always been this massive canvas for our deepest fears. But now, you aren't just a passenger on this ride anymore. You know the history, you know the lighting techniques, you know exactly how to manipulate sound and simulate panic. So the next time you're sitting in the dark, wondering what might be waiting for you on an empty road at 2:17 a.m., ask yourself, how are you going to use these tools to tell your own terrifying story? Thanks for joining me on this explainer. And hey, stay safe out there.